I'm excited to have my next guest back on Sports Card Nation again on the Sports Card Show Shop at guest line. Uh, Recently back from Qatar from the World Cup, and Professor Clemente Lisi, welcome.
Thanks for having me back and Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year. I guess we'll start off. First time the cup was held there. Your first time in the country of Qatar. Obviously, I've never been there. Probably most people listening to this episode probably haven't been there. Kind of your observations, your thoughts of the country and how they hosted the World Cup.
Right. Well, as your listeners know, on the eve of the World Cup, there was a lot of discussion about, can Qatar host this thing? It's a very small country. It's about the size of Connecticut. There was all these issues regarding migrant workers and the building of stadiums, LGBTQ rights, all this stuff. We all know about this.
Mm-hmm.
I was there for the final week of the World Cup, and I watched the first 3 weeks on television, on Fox. And they did an extraordinary job. And it's not surprising because countries that host the World Cup spend tens of millions, hundreds of millions, in this case, billions of dollars. And Qatar basically built something out of nothing. I often compare it to Las Vegas. They built something out of the desert. They built stadiums, they built skyscrapers, they built a subway line 2 years ago. So they basically built infrastructure just for this tournament. And it was a pretty amazing experience. I think if you watched it on TV, you got that impression. But just being there on the ground and seeing all these modern facilities and these amazing stadiums, it was a sight to behold. And I will say, I think in the future, Qatar will host probably Summer Olympics. That wouldn't surprise me, and other major events because they have the infrastructure in place to do so.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You said this is your fourth World Cup. Obviously, it was held at a different time of the year because of the heat factor. Was it any different? Could you tell, or if you didn't know what calendar month you're in, you wouldn't know any different.
Yeah, look, it impacted us here because we're watching the NFL and watching the World Cup. We're watching World Cup games on Thanksgiving weekend. I mean, that was weird. I will say, in hindsight, it was pretty amazing to be able to do that over the 4 day Thanksgiving weekend. My daughter and I, we watched almost every game because the TV was just on nonstop. And if you look at Fox's ratings for the U.S. England game, it was the highest rated U.S. men's game ever. But it also didn't hurt football and the other events because I think people just used it as an opportunity, especially on the East Coast. It's cold, people have nowhere to go. They're watching. Being in Qatar was different because it's a majority Muslim nation. So you walk around and there are no Christmas decorations. It was 85 degrees. I felt like I took an airplane from New York and went to June or July, right? It was almost like I traveled not just through space but time. And so being there, I felt like it was July. It was really weird for that week. And to be honest, it was so cold in New York that I was actually happy not to be here. It was like in the 20s, I think. So being there was being like in a bit of a time warp. So for that week, I was there. It felt really weird. I also, in the back of my mind, knew I had to do some Christmas shopping. So luckily, I did a little bit of that in Qatar because aside from all the stadiums they built, there's a lot of shopping malls. And the reason for that is because it's so hot there in the summer. It's like 105 degrees. People have to be inside. And so they built
Yeah.
these enormous shopping centers. And it was a lot of fun to walk around and see different things. So I did a little Christmas shopping, and I also got to enjoy the warm weather, which was nice.
Very, very cool. And yeah, it was definitely warmer there than in New York State and especially here in Syracuse, even. So, which is usually colder than my hometown of Brooklyn. Let's start with the final, right? Arguably, many have said, one of the greatest finals. Some have actually just went there and said, hey, this is the greatest final in World Cup history. Definitely had storylines, right? Mbappe versus Messi, France trying to repeat, Messi trying to get his first ever World Cup after saying it would be his last one that he would play in, win or lose. And here he is in the final. You got all these storylines. I watched the game. Wasn't the only match I watched, but obviously the last one because it was the final. And from an amateur soccer fan, I'll call myself that, especially compared to you, it was exciting. There was scoring, there was edge of your seat moments and all that stuff. I mean, do you agree with that? As being there in person, I'm watching in my living room. Obviously, you're there in the stands. Your assessment of the final. Do you agree with most of the pundits that it was the greatest? I mean, you wrote probably the preeminent book on World Cup history, so you have you have some credence here. I mean, what's your assessment of compared to what others are chiming in with?
No, I have to say that if it's not number one, it's the top two or three. I think it's the number one, and all those storylines you mentioned were all true. And oftentimes, as you know, whether it's a World Cup final or a Super Bowl or whatever, there's a lot of build up to that, and oftentimes the game doesn't live up to the hype. In
Yep.
this case, I think it lived up to the hype and then some, which was pretty amazing. And the Messi Mbappe fight ended up being a real thing because Messi scored 2 goals. Mbappe scored a hat trick. If someone had told me on the eve of the game that Mbappe would score 3 goals and they would lose, I'd tell you, well, that's impossible. I mean, what would have to happen for that to be the case? And it was back and forth. The first half, as you recall, was all Argentina, and it
Yep.
was done. And I thought, okay, they're going to score a third in the second half and they put the game away. And you know what? It wouldn't have been a great final, but it would have been a coronation for Messi, which I think a lot of neutrals were looking for. And in terms of journalism as a storyline, it was a great story. It's like not does he only does he win the World Cup and equal Maradona, but he becomes the GOAT, which is what people were
Yeah.
looking for. Kind of like that Tom Brady Super Bowl from a few years back. It's like if he wins this, he surpasses Montana, he's the GOAT. Okay. And he did it, but in such dramatic style. A 3-3 game. They go to penalties. I mean, France comes back. Mbappe scores 2 goals in 2 minutes. Messi scores in extra time. Mbappe scores the penalty kick again. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better game. And being in the stands was pretty exciting. I happened to be sitting in an area of mostly French journalists, so they were not that happy. But just the stadium was about 85-90% Argentina, because people from Argentina had flown there, but a lot of neutral fans, a lot of the locals, a lot of the people in the Middle East, they love
Yeah.
Messi because Messi's a global icon, and they were cheering for Messi. And in the end, they got, I think, the final that people had dreamt of. I will say though, kudos to Mbappe. At 24 years old, he's the future of this sport, and
Mhm.
he's already won one World Cup. I can see him winning another one or two in the future.
Yeah, all great points, and like you said, I mean, you couldn't have scripted this. It was like almost like a Disney movie, but it was real, right?
Right,
Not no credits at the end. This is real life.
right.
I mean, talk about the significance. To Messi, like I said, this will be at least this is what he said. It will be his last World Cup, and I know it's not on the same par, but like I'm a Steeler fan, so it reminds me of when Jerome Bettis announced that this season, was going to be it was going to be his last, and the Steelers win the Super Bowl, and they came very close to not having that happen. Just talk about the significance of him announcing that it would be his last World Cup, and he did that before they even knew they were actually in the final. So this wasn't like tomorrow's going to be my last appearance. He announced that before the tournament even started. But the significance of it being his last one and winning it and in that style, and like you said, a great matchup with probably the next guy, the face of the sport.
Yeah, no, totally. It was Messi's last dance. It was do or die, and that put more pressure on the team. If you recall, they lost their opener to Saudi Arabia, and so
Yep.
from that point on, Argentina was playing elimination round, even though they were in the group stage. Still, they had to win all the games, and they did it, and it came close against the Netherlands in the quarterfinals. Again, they gave up a 2 goal lead. They won on penalties. In the final, the same thing. So they couldn't maintain a lead, but ultimately Messi came through. He showed the quality. At 35 years old, that's pretty old for a soccer player, and to want him to come back at age 39 in 4 years is really a big mountain to climb. If you saw Ronaldo, Cristiano Ronaldo at the World Cup, he's 37, 38. And at one point he got benched during the tournament because he can't do the full 90. He just can't. What's going to
Yeah.
happen in Argentina, though, the interesting thing is repeating as champion is extremely difficult. France tried it, it didn't work. The last team to do that was 1962 when Brazil won back to back with Pelé, right? So it's that
Yeah.
difficult to do. And Pelé passed away recently. We'll talk about that in a bit. But
Yeah.
so it's very difficult to do. And what will happen now, I think, is that it's what's next is who's the next Messi? Who will be the number 10 for Argentina that keeps this going? Because fans want to win. Let's not forget that there was a 34-year gap, 36-year gap between Maradona's World Cup and this World Cup. So World Cups are hard to win. They happen once every 4 years, and you could
Yeah.
be in the wilderness for decades before you win it again. I know the champagne is still going, and the confetti probably hasn't been cleaned up yet. And Argentina fans are probably thinking, "Why are you talking about this?" Because Messi said he's going to play with the team in the future, just not at the World Cup because that's 4 years from now. But Argentina has lots of other tournaments they look forward to, including Copa America, which is a South American championship, which they won last year and will happen again in 2 years. It's kind of a shame because at 39 years old, I don't see Messi continuing, but it would be a shame because the U.S. will be hosting the World Cup in 2026, and to see him here would have been pretty amazing. But you just never know, though. I mean, Tom Brady is still here, so you just don't
Yeah.
know. In soccer, it's very difficult to be able to keep that pace and rhythm at 40 years old when you're playing against defenders who are 22. So
That was my next question, Clemente. I know what he said, and it's happened in other sports, right? Someone retires, and then heck, we talk about Brady. He did that, right? He retired. You think there's any chance, Messi, goes against what comes back and said, "Listen, we're the defending World Cup champions. I gotta for my country. I gotta at least give my best effort and defend." You think we'll see him in 2026 here in North America?
I think it's 50-50. I think there's a few pressures here. The pressure from sponsors and from, just the whole marketing machine that demands that you have a player of that caliber on the field, but also his desire. I mean, I always say when I see I mentioned Tom Brady or other quarterbacks or other athletes when they win something and they're at 40 or 35, I always say, look, I quit at the top. I would leave now. But the desire to keep going, I get that. Like, the fact that you want to just keep going to work, I get that motivation. And, I don't say never. I think Messi at 39 years old, if there is no heir, there's no somebody else to fill his shoes. If he tells the coach, look, I want to come back, would you ever say no to Messi? No. Even if he's off the bench, you'd keep him.
Yeah.
So I think it's 50-50. You never know.
Yeah. All right, we got to talk about the United States performance in the tournament. They got out of the group stage into the knockout round. They didn't score a lot of goals. They played some tie games. Played a great match against England that ended in a 0-0 tie. As a United States citizen and resident, and soccer expert, I mean, what's your assessment? Of their performance overall.
Look, it's the odd thing with the United States is that if they get knocked out in the group stage, it's a disappointment. And if they reach the quarterfinals, it's a success. So the round of 16, which is where they typically get eliminated, which happened against the Netherlands, is kind of that in-between zone. And so it was a great World Cup. Look, in the group stage, I know it was very tactical. They scored very few goals, but it was edge of your seat every one of those games. And the biggest mistake they made was they couldn't get a win in the first game against Wales, which they deserved. Right. The
Hmm.
England game, look, 0-0 against England, and England has still never beaten the United States at the World Cup. So for all the history and tradition that England has, when they face the US, it's always a tough game. And that was a fun game. That was a day after Thanksgiving. I went to a sports bar out on Long Island, and even people who never watch soccer were in that place packed at like 2 o'clock on a Friday, So it was fun to see people getting into the game, into the sport, and the U.S. held their heads high. And then the Iran game was do or die. And look, Christian Pulisic came through. He scored that goal. He injured himself on the goal. The U.S. hung on. And against the Netherlands, they could have easily even won that game, but they were in that game. You can tell the difference between a European power and the U.S., which was the U.S. is very naive defensively. they left too much space in the back, and of course, a team like that is going to counterattack and score on you. So the legacy here of this, when we think back to this World Cup and think about the United States, I think we're going to think of it as a stepping stone to 2026, because the United States was average age was 24 years old. Okay, they were the second youngest team at the tournament. This is all to build for the next World Cup, which is a long time from now, but World Cups work in cycles. And so these guys are going to be around for the next one and maybe even 2030. And you have to sort of build team unity. Of course, for those of listening and know a little bit about what's happening, the United States is national team is a little bit of a bit of a mess right now because the coach has had his contract renewed. There's all these past allegations regarding domestic violence. How that all pans out, we don't know. But either Greg Berhalter will get rehired or they'll hire another coach. And that person will have 4 years to build. But this is all about building to the next World Cup. And also, I think while you're building, you're growing audience. And I think the World Cup, there are people who came up to me, family members, friends, friends of mine who have kids who said to me, my kid really got into the World Cup. We watched so many games. We never watched so many. And I think that has a lingering effect. That has a way of growing the sport in this country, which, we still talk about that. But when we talk about the United States and soccer, it's always about building the game and making it more mainstream. And I think this World Cup went a long way in doing that.
Yeah, they definitely didn't. They didn't embarrass themselves, and like you said, it's gonna. Some of the World Cup will be on U.S. soil in 2026, and so there'll be a lot of anticipation. Based on this performance, getting out of the group stage and now being one of the host countries, there'll be a lot of anticipation to see. Maybe they can go even a little bit further. You mentioned some of the coaching controversy, if you will, be interesting to see, how that sort of plays itself out. I would hope whatever the outcome is, it sort of gets resolved kind of quickly so they can, be on, be a little more stable going into a home World Cup, if you will, rather than sort of a lot of things up in the air or a new coach late with less time to prepare for that kind of tournament. So a lot of storylines, even especially on the U.S. front, going into the next World Cup. My son, who watched a lot of it along with me, knowing that it's going to be in North America. I know, I believe some games in Toronto, New York, if I'm not mistaken. He's expressed an interest. They're like, "Hey, can you think we can go?" And I said, "We'll see. We got a little bit of time." But speaking of that, are tickets tough to like? How tough of a ticket was it to go to Qatar to see it, and how tough of a ticket might it be here in 2026 for those thinking about attending?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So yeah, the World Cup tickets go on sale about a year before the World Cup because at that point you'll know most of the teams have qualified, and they'll do the World Cup draw, and then they'll put different groups in different cities, and you'll know. And New York is definitely one of the cities that's hosting the World Cup, and actually New York, Los Angeles, and Dallas are all pretty much competing for the final. I should mention that the U.S. will co-host the World Cup with Canada and Mexico, so there'll be games in those countries
Yeah,
as well. So what happens is about a year before the World Cup, tickets go on sale, and they were online pre-sale, and you're buying tickets to the group stage. What ends up happening is if you buy a block of tickets for the group stage, you're pretty much married to the team that ends up winning the group. So if your team doesn't win the group, now you have all these tickets you don't want, and you can resell them on their platforms. The big issue in Qatar was, one, they had very few hotels. Two, it was very far away and very expensive to fly there. So a lot of people didn't go, even though I will admit a lot of Argentines were there and a lot of Americans went there earlier in the tournament. I mean, for the US games, there were, from what I read and saw, there were a lot of Americans there. And a lot of people, from Europe that went as well. Now, there weren't as many going from Europe, even though they were closer, because, like I said, it's very expensive. But there were also a lot of fake tickets and scalpers, and there were all kinds of warnings. Like if some guy on Twitter says, "I have 3 tickets, just DM me and send me the money," don't do that. It's one of those
yeah,
things where you have to go on the FIFA website and you can buy and sell your own tickets. And I will say this: all the tickets, it was all paperless. It was all phones. So I know people are into grading tickets. That wasn't happening at this World Cup. It was the first World Cup I can remember. It was the first World Cup I can remember where there was no paper. Now I don't know if you print your ticket out, if that counts as a real ticket, but it's not. It's not. It's not the real ticket. You would walk in there with your phone, and they would just beep your phone. And so,
Yeah,
so for those people who are interested in the World Cup in 2026, I have lots of people I know are like, "Hey, there's a World Cup in Boston. It's in New York. It's in Miami. I want to go." I'm like, "Look, slow down. You're way ahead of time." But the resale, you can go to StubHub and buy tickets too, and the resale on like the final, for example, tickets were going for like $4,000 or $5,000. Now, World Cup tickets in general are not that expensive. If you want to go to a regular World Cup game, you can go for $80 or $100. It's just
yeah,
about a matter of gobbling them up fast enough, and then when you want to resell them, that's where the money is made. And of course, when you're selling tickets months in advance to games in the knockout stage, you don't even know what teams are there. They're fairly cheap because you're buying just like there's people I know who say, look, I'm going to go to the World Cup final. I don't care who's playing in it. It's the final. Or I want to go to the quarterfinals because, heck, it's still the quarterfinal of a World Cup. I want to go. Once the teams start populating the bracket and you're getting close to the nitty gritty, then everyone's paying attention, and that's when the prices go up. But stay tuned. I mean, trust me, when tickets go on sale in this country in a few years, look, they'll sell because the
yeah,
United States still holds the record back in '94 for the most tickets ever sold at a World Cup. I mean, there were empty seats in Qatar, not for the elimination
yeah,
round. In the group stage, there were some empty seats. In the
yeah.
U.S., there won't be because the U.S. is a huge soccer market, more than people think, and there's so many nationalities here that everyone has a rooting interest. I always tell people if you're unable to go to a World Cup, the second best thing is to go to a major American city and watch the World Cup at a bar because everyone from around the world is there.
Yeah, no doubt. I want to follow up a question. You mentioned that it basically was ticketless. Everything was, with the barcodes on your phone.
Right.
Now that even in other sports, football, baseball, it's going that way. But one thing, if something significant happens during the game, you can go to the box office and actually request a hard copy ticket of your seats. Do you know? Ticket grading has become a thing here in the last year or two. It's been a thing even before that, but it's gotten more sort of popular. Do you know, was that possible in Qatar? Could you go to the box office there and say, "Hey, I know I don't have the hard copy tickets, but I would like to have them as a memento of being here." Do you know if that
Yeah,
was
no, I don't know if
were
you
they
can.
doing that?
I don't know if you can get it printed out, but I do know that the Qatari citizens had the paper option because I did see locals with tickets. Actually, after the final was over, amid all the hoopla, hours after the game was over, I made my way out of the stadium to the subway station, the metro, and there was a guy standing there with a sign, a homemade sign that said like, "Please give me your World Cup tickets for my collection." I wish I had time to talk to this guy because I had, it was so crowded, everyone was moving quickly. And I thought, oh, there's a guy who collects tickets and he's here. He might not have gone to the game, but he wants a stub, right? And
Yeah,
we just need to see if these pop up on eBay or somewhere else. But I think there's a lot less of them than normal. And of course, for the final itself, there's very few of them. I will admit that as a member of the press, we were forced to print out a paper ticket, and so I have a paper ticket. I have paper tickets from all of my World Cup finals because the media gets a ticket. It's called a media ticket. It looks just like a
yeah,
regular ticket. I've never gotten that graded. And, I will admit, and I'll make a confession here, that amid all this ticket grading hoopla, I've kind of ignored it. But I feel like I can't ignore it now. A lot of people are talking about it. There's some value in it, and I get. Look, if you're collecting Super Bowl tickets, some of them are beautiful. Like
yeah,
the World Cup tickets I have and have seen have very little on them. So they're not so
yeah.
pretty. But I think there is a market for it, and like I said, there was this guy outside the stadium looking for stubs, which makes me think that there might have been some out there.
Yeah, and no doubt, like we talked about it, kind of when we first opened up the conversation. Arguably one of the greatest World Cup finals, Messi's first ever, right? So the significance of a graded ticket stub for that event is, for people who are into that sort of thing, that's going to be definitely a highly sought after collectible in that space. So that's kind of why I asked if I know here in the states with NFL, MLB, NHL, even if you have like the ticket on your phone, which is what most of the 80% or whatever high percent, you can request if you so desire a hard copy ticket before you go home for the night. So I just was one. That's why I asked that question. So a lot of upsets in this tournament. You talked about one right off the bat, right? Saudi Arabia 2, Argentina 1, Japan beat Germany, shut them out even, and South Korea beat Portugal, and Portugal wound up having a pretty good run in the end. Uh, would again would you did the upsets surprise you as a soccer guy, or do you think that the parity's maybe better than it's ever been before? So while they're upsets in paper, just some of those teams you don't expect to win those games, they're traditionally better now. How would you assess
No, I
that?
agree. I agree with that. I think, it's not like if you read my book, you go back a few decades, it was hard to scout teams. Now there are no secrets. Everyone's got the internet, television, technology. There's nothing Japan is doing that we don't know about, and vice versa. And
Yeah,
so these teams are getting better while some of the European teams like Germany are still sort of in transition. You didn't mention the what was the biggest upset really was Morocco reaching the semifinals and getting the fourth
yeah,
place, which was fun. And I will say, after Qatar crashed out early, the locals, the people in that part of the world, all rallied around an Arab nation, and it was fun to watch. Because when I was there, Morocco was in the semifinals and ended up finishing fourth, which was an amazing achievement for them. And there were so many Moroccan fans, but I couldn't tell if they were from Morocco or if they were just locals who had taken on the Morocco. It became like kind of like the George Mason of 15 years ago. They got far, and they it's hard for one of those teams to win the World Cup. There was at no point, even after they beat Portugal and they got to the semifinal, there was no point that I think Morocco will win the World Cup. And part of me did not want them to reach the final because I did want France Argentina. I wanted the clash of titans. I wanted that. My fear was that if a Morocco got to the final or Croatia, that it would maybe not create that tension which we ultimately witnessed. But yeah, I think it's much harder for these teams to win it. But I will say, in 4 years from now, the World Cup will go from 32 teams to 48 teams. So a lot more chance for other countries to get into the tournament, and I think upsets can happen, especially in the knockout round when, you know, one team versus another, anything can happen. I think a lot of the European and South American teams, the established powers, often underestimate these teams. One thing to really consider is that even a team like Morocco, most of those guys play in Europe. They play at the highest
yeah,
level. They're not playing like in the local league. Now, Saudi Arabia, that was interesting. They all their players played in their domestic championship, and that was a true upset. Now, having said that, what do we know about the Saudi league? Well, we don't know much, but I know this, that Cristiano Ronaldo just signed to play there for $200 million for 2 years. If you compare that to Aaron Judge, his contract is $200 million for like 7 years. Tells you a little bit about how deep pocketed the Saudis are. And for those of you following the
yeah,
live golf thing, these countries are trying through sports to show domination, and because they have oil money, they can do it. So,
yeah.
so the sort of the pecking order of international sports, but even soccer, I think is a little topsy turvy. So these upsets, while they were fun, I think there'll be more in the future for sure.
Yeah, as like you said, there's film, there's scouting, there's people doing the research and
Analytics,
coaches too.
yeah,
Yeah,
the coaching, but also the analytics now. I mean, all sports
yeah,
have these analytics people on staff who, basically Moneyball created that for all sports, and
yeah,
everyone's doing that now. So.
yeah, no doubt. One last thing, and I knew it worked like this before the World Cup, but one of my things I don't like is the penalty kicks. Right, there's a foul, somebody gets tripped or pushed or tackled illegally, and then like the best player and not the person who necessarily gets fouled takes the penalty kick. For Argentina, it was always Messi. The only thing I'd like to see, and again, it's not going to happen. It's just me ranting out loud. I think it's kind of like basketball, right? You're driving to the hoop, you get fouled, you go to the free throw, you take the two free throw shots. I would like to see, the guy who gets fouled have to take the penalty kick, right? It's going to be highly successful, most likely anyway. The goalie is really most of the time guessing, left or right, and even if he guesses right, doesn't mean necessarily he'll make the save anyway. Your thoughts. I mean, you're more of a fan, frankly, than I am, and an expert. I just think like you get tackled, you get fouled, you should reap the rewards of your efforts. Yet, the best player comes in, and takes you take the you get the foul, and then your teammate gets to kick the ball. What do you think of am I nuts, or what are your thoughts
It's
on that?
interesting. It's interesting. I mean, oftentimes you have players who are specialists at penalty kicks, and you see that in the shootouts, right? They pick the five
Yeah,
guys they think they can do better. I've never heard anybody actually say that the player that gets the foul should take the kick. And as much as I'm a purist and I hate changes, not just in soccer but in life, I will admit your idea is a pretty interesting one. To force the player who got fouled to take it would be interesting because it would a little bit even out the playing field because as of right now, 65 to 75% of those kicks make it in. So the goalie is
yeah,
behind the percentage wise, he's at disadvantage. Even though we did see in the shootouts a team like
yeah,
Croatia was absolutely amazing what they were able to do. Not just here, but even 4 years ago at the World Cup in Russia. But I like your idea, and I've never had anyone actually throw it out there. So I think it's interesting. I mean, will it happen? No, because FIFA is so averse to changes. Also, oftentimes your best player takes the kick because they want to pad out their goals, right? I mean, the fact that Mbappe took all the kicks for France, that helped him be the tournament top
yeah,
scorer. And there's people who've said to me, well, wouldn't it be interesting if the penalty kicks, they count obviously in the game if you score them, but you don't count them in the top scorer list? That's interesting because that's almost like a free goal. That's why penalty
yeah,
kicks matter so much during a game, and that's why they review them now because players, as you know, in soccer, they love to dive, they love to take a minimal contact, and I will say at this World Cup, the referees were pretty good at clamping down on that because it became ridiculous in the past. And I think the only reason they brought instant replay at the soccer was really to try to negotiate this penalty kick business, which a lot of players oftentimes on replay, the referee in real time can't often see it. And then when you watch the replay, you're like, wow, that guy wasn't even touched and they got a penalty for that. So,
yeah,
FIFA is always thinking about innovation, thinking about how to make the game better. So having said that, but they're also averse to change, which are these two, because so many people around the world love the game the way it is. That and we did see at this World Cup, for example, something that annoyed me was referees being told to clamp down on time wasting. And as a result, they were adding 10 minutes, 9 minutes to games, which, if you watch the Premier League or MLS, typically you get 2 or 3 minutes. So all of a sudden, you're up 1-0 and you think this game is pretty much over, and the referee goes 10 minutes. And now you have 10 more minutes. And oftentimes goals were scored in that time. It made it for a more exciting tournament. But I wasn't crazy about all the time added on either because I remember in the US Iran game, that became extremely stressful at the end when the US was hanging on to a 1-0 lead and they needed the win. And, it wasn't good for my heart. But at the same time, I get that referees want to add time because, basically in soccer, you play 90 minutes. But if you count the actual minutes of play, you're talking about 55 to 60 minutes. So about 30 minutes of that is just nothing, right? In American sports, the clock stops. There's been talk about that maybe in soccer to stop the clock if the ball goes out of bounds or if the ball or the guy's rolling around on the ground for 45 seconds. Why is the clock going here? We're not, even if you try to add that time on, you're never really going to fully recover it. So these are things that we have to see in the future if they address, especially as the sport becomes bigger and better on TV.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's like a lot of other sports. You might have some but eventually, you've got to adapt to the times and technology, and frankly, what the fans want. Right? They're the ones, buying tickets, buying jerseys, and whatnot. So I think if there's enough of a call for it, even an organization that may be resistant to change will at least consider it. If you will.
Right.
Um, Got to talk about it, right? This is not just a soccer loss, but a sports and a human loss. The passing of a goat in Pele. While many knew he was sort of in ill health, and the end was probably kind of near. When it happens, obviously, reality and finality sets in, and you don't have to be a soccer fan, who he was and what it's funny. I saw someone said, someone posted the Michael Jordan of soccer passed away. We lost a goat, and someone was I got a kick out of it because it's probably true. Someone responded, no. uh, the Michael Jordan's the Pele of basketball, and he was just bigger than the sport. You didn't have to be a soccer fan to know who Pele was. He was, a dignitary. Met with presidents and whatnot. Just talk about what he meant to the sport and what his loss kind of leaves that whole I know we got today's greats, but just speak of the loss and what it means to fans and the sports and all that encompasses.
Yeah, no, I think if you're growing up in the 80s and 90s, like we were, even though Pele was retired by then, but Pele was the type of athlete, I put him in the same category as a Muhammad Ali, where you don't have to be a boxing fan to know who Muhammad Ali is. It's someone who transcends the sport, it becomes a pop culture figure, a global icon. And since we knew Pele was sick for a while, but it never really becomes something real until they die. Then you kind of look back on their life. And it was very upsetting for me. And I think also for a lot of Americans, because unlike Messi or Ronaldo or Maradona, those athletes don't have a connection to this country. But Pele actually came here, played here for 2 years, 3 years. He won the NASL Soccer Bowl in 1977. He retired as a New York Cosmos player. What I found interesting was just being on Facebook and social media and hearing people tell stories about actually having met him. Because unlike these international sports stars, most Americans don't meet them. Pele had a connection to this country. He played his entire club career at Santos, which is a Brazilian soccer team. He could have gone to Europe. He could have gone everywhere. He never went anywhere. He just stayed in his home country. At the World Cup, he won 3 World Cups. 1958, he won one as a 17-year-old. He has many records. He is the original GOAT. And he is, and prior to Pele, there were many great soccer players. But Pele came of age at a time when television was growing, satellite TV was becoming a thing in the 60s and 70s, and communication was improving. And so that gave you the opportunity to become a global icon. And then, in the 90s, he was a spokesman for Puma and MasterCard, and everyone remembers him. And, there wasn't a commercial if Pele wasn't in. Everybody knew Pele. If you showed a picture of Pele to somebody in the street, they would probably be able to name him. I wanted to share a story with you. In 2007,
Yes.
I heard that Pele was. I was a reporter then, and at the time, and 2007, Pele was making an appearance in Times Square. Now, this was not uncommon for Pele to just show up somewhere and do some kind of promotional thing. I remember going there, and there were a bunch of New York reporters there at the time. And he gave a press conference, and then the press conference was over, and all the reporters were kind of like, they were kind of a bit upset. They weren't able to ask any questions. I remember, and the press person came on and said, "Don't worry, we're gonna put you guys in a room, and individually you can interview Pele." And this was 2007 when David Beckham had just announced he was coming to play in MLS. So David Beckham was a huge name in soccer, and the fact that he was coming here back at the time really helped MLS grow, but there were parallels to Beckham's arrival to Pele's arrival, decades earlier. And I remember walking into a room and seeing Pele standing there. And Pele must have been a Ray at that point, 70 years old. He looked like he was like 40 years old. He was fit.
Yeah.
He unlike other athletes who gain weight after their playing days or whatever, he looked like he can suit up, right? And I remember walking up to him and I said to him, "Oh, it's a pleasure to meet you. You look great." And he was like, "Oh, thank you so much." And he hugged me. And I've met lots of athletes. You have as well at shows.
Yeah.
I've interviewed lots of. No one has ever hugged me, you know. And I remember thinking, oh, and I said to him, my mother was a teenager growing up in Italy, and I said, 1970, Brazil beat Italy in the World Cup final, and I said, my mother still talks about how disappointed she was about that. And he goes, "Oh, I'm really sorry about that." And I'm thinking, Pele is not really apologizing for winning the World Cup, is he? Um, but he was so gracious. And I remember we asked him questions and we talked about Beckham coming here and the challenges of playing in America and what it was like when he got here, basically how soccer at the time was really just a college game in this country and there was no professional. I mean, the NASL was here, but it didn't have that outlet. The fans weren't here. And he basically came as an ambassador. And the end of the year when he passed away, I thought about that story kind of over and over again. I told my kids about it. It had more meaning for me now that he's passed away. That story, it felt like it happened yesterday when I haven't thought about it in years. But I think
Hmm.
when someone dies, people tend to say nice things, right? I think in this case, they're true. Pele was a gentleman,
Yeah.
was a humanitarian, a lovely person, and it's a shame that he's not here. I remember that night, my daughter and I watched a movie called Hot Shot that he was in. It's a movie that did not do that well, and Pele's in it. He was also in the movie Victory. So if you're interested in seeing
Yeah.
Pele, the actor, Pele was in a few movies. He also recorded albums. I went to YouTube and listened to a little bit of his singing. My daughter and I watched some of his greatest goals. And it was kind of bittersweet because it was the end of 2022. And so when you come to the end of a year, you tend to sort of
Yeah.
look back and then having someone pass away. And this happens every year. I'm sure listeners can recall every year. It seems at the end of the year, I mean, Betty White died the year before. There's always that kind of that rush of people dying at the end. And we had Barbara Walters, who, by the way, I met as well.
Yeah.
I worked at ABC News, so I worked with her. I met her a few times. And we had Pope Benedict die all in the span of a few days. And it kind of was,
Yeah.
for me, it was kind of a way to think back and think, oh, and even I know Barbara Walters is not a hobby person, but Barbara Walters died on a Friday night and they had to interrupt 2020 to announce her death. And I thought,
Yeah.
that isn't fate of some sort that they had to interrupt her show that I grew up watching every Friday with Hugh Downs. And John, we're showing
Yeah.
our age here. Um,
Yeah.
so to me, so Pelle's death with the deaths of these other people at the end kind of made me kind of think of the past. And but the great thing about Pele is, and all these athletes when they pass away, is they live on. When we talk about them, when we
Yeah.
watch video of them, YouTube videos of them, and I think Pele, to some people, he still is the GOAT. They don't care about Messi or
Yeah.
Maradona or Mbappe. They think it's Pele. No one's won 3 World Cups. No one's scored over a
Yeah.
thousand goals. And in a lot of ways, maybe he really is the GOAT still.
Yeah, well said, and that's what I've heard. I've never met him, like you have, but people who've met him or know him say that exactly what you said. Like he's down to earth, not an arrogant. He's just a normal guy, a legendary soccer player, but just very personable, cares about people. And again, I know you talk about timing and Barbara Walters passing, and it breaking into 2020. I was watching it too. It's funny to hear you say that. The thing I thought was like, I don't know how much and what condition he was in the last few weeks, but or if he even got to watch any of the World Cup. But the first thing I thought of, it might be kind of silly, or I just thought like at least like the World Cup was over and then he passed away. It wasn't like during it or before it. It almost like he lasted through got the World Cup in, and then he passed on. Again, I'm probably making more of that than is really there, but that's the first thing that kind of hit me was like the timing of it. It,
Well, you
it
make a
may be
good
more
yeah.
incidental, coincidental, but I just thought that was sort of, I don't know, odd or just kind
Well,
of,
you make a good point because during the World Cup, they did say he was very ill, and I think they were trying to prepare the
yeah,
world for it. And I remember the Brazilian team was a little bit motivated by this, and I thought, oh, if he dies during the
yeah,
World Cup, the Brazilian team might use that as a rally cry, and
yeah,
then he didn't die during the World Cup, which I thought was good. Because I thought maybe his death during the World Cup would be overshadowed somehow because the games must go on, that kind of thing. And then the fact that he put out a statement, congratulating Messi, not that he
yeah,
that himself, his people did it, but I think
yeah,
he might have actually enjoyed the World Cup at the end. And I know that at the very, very end, he was basically fighting colon cancer and was basically tied up to
yeah.
machines. Um, but the fact that his mother's 100 years old and still alive,
Wow.
it's pretty amazing. And the fact that he had a pretty loving family, and he had a huge, a funeral in Santos where thousands of people showed up. People have to understand, and I think if you read my book, you get. There's a lot of Pele in my book, obviously,
Yeah,
that you get that in the 1940s and 50s, the world was a much bigger place than it is today. And when we think Brazil, we all know where it is and what Brazilian
yeah,
culture might be like, and whatever. But in 1950s, people didn't know what Brazil was. He put Brazil on the map. Anywhere you go in the world, you say Brazil, word association, you probably say either Carnival or Pele, right?
yep,
And so I think the power of soccer is such that anywhere in the world you meet a Brazilian, inevitably you might bring up Pele, and
yep,
so it's pretty amazing. And like I said, I just enjoyed reading all the story. I had a story that I shared with you now, but so many other stories of Pele showing up at various places in the United States as an ambassador, and everywhere he went, he had a smile on his face. And you know what I think he had that a lot of people don't have, not just athletes, humility. He was humble. And the
yeah,
fact that he made you feel like you were the most important person there is pretty astonishing. And the fact that maybe
yep,
because he was Brazilian, he was warm, I still don't forget. I mean, why would you hug me? Why would you embrace me? Because I think he was that loving. That was just his way
yeah,
of showing. I put my hand out to shake it, and he basically hugged me.
yeah,
So and that I don't think anybody will ever do that again. Any other famous person in my life will ever
yeah,
do that. And so it's the kind of thing that shows, I think, the kind of person he was. And I think there were two people. There was Pele, the athlete, the player, and there was Edson, his birth name, Edson Arantes do
yeah,
Nascimento. And I think Edson was just a regular guy. And sometimes
yeah,
I think athletes don't know how to negotiate that. And he did. And,
yeah,
maybe he did it at a time when it was a more simple time, maybe in the 1970s when the demands of the modern athlete are very different. And maybe that's the difference, not just personality, but also the demands that the public has on these personalities. I mean, we live in a world today where social media, athletes post stuff. I mean, Pele didn't Pele wasn't posting stuff on Instagram, it didn't exist. And so I think it's a very different um, relationship we have now with the athletes in our lives. So
yeah. No doubt. Well said. And you have a moment you'll remember forever. And like you said, that's very uncommon with athletes, especially today's athletes. The last time you were on, Clemente, we mentioned like, hey, let's talk about the soccer card hobby after the World Cup is completed. We're there. Your thoughts? Do you think? Obviously, there was a lot of build up leading up to the World Cup. What do you think? Hobby wise, is obviously a terrific final, arguably the greatest final ever. What do you think that does to the soccer card hobby? And kind of leading in, I know it's 4 years away still, but here in the states, the anticipation of having that event on soil, what do you think that bodes for the hobby part of soccer?
yeah, so during the tournament, you might have noticed there were some cards that went up and down in value based on the performances of players. There was a player that on the Dutch team named Cody Gakpo. He scored a couple of goals. He now plays for Liverpool. His rookie card is in the Panini Prism World Cup set that came out during the World Cup, and I think his will have some value. But ultimately, the players that achieve the most at the World Cup already have cards that are valued at a high price. So, like for Messi cards, they're already pretty expensive. And so, this may be if you want to get his rookie card from 20 years ago, the Panini rookie card. I mean, you're talking about a ten to $20,000 card in a good grade, and then you're talking about maybe $2,000 or $3,000 in a PSA 5 or 6. Those prices were pretty high before, and they're not going to get better. I'll give you an example. The Panini Prism base card from this year's World Cup set, the day after the World Cup final, was selling for $300 on eBay. And my first thought was, who's going to tell these people that there's about 6 million of those cards, right? But because there was, it's kind of like when someone dies, like Pelé. When he died, I went on eBay, and all of a sudden, there's all these new listings for Pelé cards, and they're all going for hundreds of dollars and that usually subsides. Now the base card of Messi, that's a $10 card, right? It's not a $300 card, but people get excited and they want a piece of the action, and they never
Yeah.
go on eBay the day after somebody wins the World Cup. I mean, just a little, just a tip, right?
PSA.
But we all get excited and we all want to own it, and we all get FOMO. So the thing is, I always tell
Yeah.
people, look, wait a month or two, and that $300 card will go back down to 15 or 10, which is what it's worth. So in that sense, it didn't help the market that much, because we're talking about expensive cards getting even more expensive. So even Kylian Mbappe, whose rookie is from 4 years ago, that's a pretty expensive card graded, even just the base. His rookie is Panini Prism World Cup 2018 rookie card. Now, forget the parallels; those are worth even more. I think because Mbappe has another 10 to 12 years in the as a player, I would buy his cards. I think he's the one to make a play
Yeah.
for, because I think he can win another World Cup. I think he could even surpass Messi on the list. He's
Yeah.
only 24 years old. I think soccer has made it in this country because, oddly enough, PSG, Paris Saint Germain, the team that Mbappe and Messi play for, they actually play on the same club team. They gave Mbappe a week off after he came back from the World Cup, and he spent that week in New York City. And
Yeah.
there were photos of Mbappe walking around Times Square in New York, basically with like a hoodie on, with like a mask, for fear of being
Yeah.
recognized. And
Yeah.
soccer is made in America when a French soccer player can't walk down the street in New York and not get recognized. I mean, for years and years, foreign players would tell me, "Oh, I love playing in America because I can go anywhere and no one knows who I am." And now they're incognito. They're wearing, get-ups, the Groucho Marx glasses. I don't know what they're doing, but they basically don't want to be seen. I'm a big fan of Mbappe's because I think he's young, he's charismatic, and I think if you want to buy his cards, they're still within reason. And I think because the World Cup is here in 4 years, I think there'll be a bigger ramp up of
Yeah.
cards. And I can see even more sets coming out and even more interest. The card market is already becoming a thing in Europe when it wasn't. It's really an American thing. Europeans and South Americans love stickers. And I will
Yeah.
admit, these stickers, they were going. Now, they came out a little earlier in October. They were selling. I mean, I bought a lot of stickers. I love stickers. I put them in the book. I don't grade them because I think stickers are made to be put in the book and complete the book, and the book is worth something. But
Yeah.
they don't have the value that the cards do. And I know, even just from being at the National last year, there were a lot of soccer cards there, more than I thought. And I don't think soccer cards are a fad. I think they're going to have some longevity. Like, for example, Formula One cards. I think that was kind of a fad. That may come and
Yeah.
go, because Formula One is a different beast altogether. But the World Cup generated so much excitement around some of these players that I think people are going to want to own a piece of that. Unfortunately, I think the price point is a little high. For example, the Panini Prism World Cup set, just a box of unopened wax is $500. Now,
Yeah.
kids are not going to buy that box, right? That's going to be people like us if we want to buy it. And so, you start to. I think the prices are a little too high, especially when in this country soccer is so young. People in college and younger are into soccer. That they're the ones ultimately who want to buy the cards, I think. And so there's got to be a way to make soccer cards more affordable, I think, for younger people who want a piece of it, because otherwise you're cutting off the sport and the hobby at the youngest point. And people like us, we can go out and buy the Mbappe rookie for $300 graded. We can probably do that, right? but
Yeah.
no 10-year-olds doing that unless I'm wrong and I see those kids at the national with those boxes walking around with $10,000 cards in them. And maybe soccer gets that bump that basketball got during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Now, I'd rather see soccer have a steady growth. My fear is
Yeah.
that it goes up and down, and then people are going to think it's a fad and then move on. I think if it has a steady growth, and with the U.S. hosting, that can only help. Hopefully, Panini America can take advantage of that somehow. I don't know how they do that, but they need to do that somehow.
Yeah, great points with the Messi versus Mbappe, right? Not with no slight to Messi, but he's on the back nine, if you will, to use a golf analogy, right? His stuff's already sort of at the ceiling. He did get a bump, obviously, based on the World Cup and the final. I know, especially on his autograph stuff. It's funny. I something just made me look before the final at what some of his autograph stuff was at, and then after he won it, I went back and sort of revisited it, and it had jumped significantly, and even his regular rookie card, like you said. But like you said, you said it perfectly, right? Mbappe's got a higher ceiling, 10 or 12 more years of competitive playing, probably at least another World Cup, if not more than one, and so his stuff's not going to really go down, barring anything tragic and injury or worse or that sort of thing. So it's a bet, if that's what you do it for, that's probably a better play card wise. And I agree too. Another great point you made, Clemente, is you want to see that steady growth rather than the roller coaster. The roller coaster scares people, literally and figuratively, right?
Yeah.
Uh, in real time, and when it comes to pricing going up and down, it just gets a little too tumultuous, and people kind of stay away and just say, you know what, I can't figure this thing out, so I'm gonna like exit stage left. So I think the steadier growth is what any sport and any hobby should pick, rather than the crescendo and then crash, if you will, then arise again. I think that just throws people about, and some people don't like that, and they exit stage left. So I think two great points there with the Mbappe and the steady growth rather than up and down. I think you hit it right on the head, and it's going to be interesting to see, right, in the next 4 years, what the soccer hobby and card and sticker market does, and the effects of a home World Cup, if you will, on the hobby. And you mentioned, the European countries and the other continents are embracing more of the card aspect of the hobby, over not over, but in addition to the traditional stickers that they already were fond of. So it'll be even interesting, not just here in the States, but even overseas, to see, with the sport building some. It's already, arguably in many of these countries, the greatest sport. But when we see a great final like we just did, to see what it even does. Even in markets they're already strong in, it can get even stronger. So it's going to be an interesting next few years, and you want to say 4 years getting into the Cup here in North America, like you said, Canada and Mexico as well. So it's going to be an interesting time in soccer, for not just the sport, but even the hobby side of the sport as well.
Well, I think the real test will be at the next national to see how many vendors have soccer, whether it's dollar boxes or the expensive stuff, and even the autographs. I think we were talking about Pele earlier. Pele reminds me a little bit of Joe DiMaggio. He did a lot of signing, like a lot of signing. I mean, not like in person,
Yeah,
but I mean like those stickers, autos that they put on cards. And there will be Pele autograph cards coming out for years because he signed many many sheets, I'm guessing, and Diego Maradona the same
yeah,
way. And I think the Messi auto is interesting, but I think it's much better value if you were able to get a Messi auto on a photo or something else. I think the cards, even though it might be a one of eight or one of one even, but there's so many autos out there, and I start to wonder if the market for autographed cards are oversaturated, and I sort of wonder
Yep.
about that. And I wonder, even going like someone like Mbappe, he signed an exclusive deal with Panini America. He came to this
Yeah.
country last summer to sign on card because so few soccer players sign on card. So there's some
Yep.
on card autos that are worth good money out of a PSG set that came out earlier this year or last year. But I wonder if he's going to be the spokesman for Panini America, how much will he sign over the next 4 years? And I can
Yep.
see him being kind of the marquee name that all the sponsors and advertisers put their arms around when the World Cup is here. But I also
Yeah.
wonder if the market gets oversaturated. I know we talk about a second junk wax era. Now you can't talk about
Yep.
junk wax when you talk about autographed cards, but at some point I wonder if you just Google or you go on eBay and you type in Mbappe auto cards and you're getting like 200 listings. I'm starting to wonder, is there too many of these cards? How rare are they? And which one is better than the other? And I think when it comes to soccer, we're
Yep.
still talking about the Wild West here a little bit. I think the market still hasn't been out long enough to really create sort of a rule. Baseball has been around for decades, and so we kind of know which cards are worth what they're worth and what the rookie card means because of that history, that long tail. We don't have that for soccer, so I do think like the next national, which I hope to be at, we can gauge the market better. I also don't know if we're going to go into a recession at some point in the next year or two. I'm a little bit curious to see how the card market long term does. The enthusiasm of the World Cup is definitely there, but I just wonder if people's wallets are in a different place than their heart and
Yep.
minds. You know?
Yeah, it's a great point. The discretionary income is today isn't what it was 2 years ago. You don't need a chart or graph to realize that. You
All I
you can
know, John,
feel it.
is
It's
all I know, John, is I'm paying $8 for eggs. So
yeah, it's a good thing I'm not a. I like eggs. I don't love eggs, so probably a good thing I don't love eggs because I can kind of live without them. But yeah,
Right.
it's and other things too, right? And it's just it's crazy. So hopefully things turn around even in that department that way. People's and my own and yours included, discretionary income goes up and our dollar goes farther, right? Obviously,
Absolutely.
we want our dollar to go as far as it can go. It's going to be. I think you summed it right up there too. It's going to be an interesting next 2 to 4 years in life and in the soccer world and hobby to see kind of what happens there.
Yeah,
But exciting as well.
the other thing I want to add too is that interesting side note is the Women's World Cup is this summer. And I wonder if the
Yep.
market for women's sports or women's soccer cards will also grow with that. And with that, maybe even players like Mia Hamm from the past can see values go up because let's not forget the Women's World Cup is not on par with the men, obviously, but the US is actually competitive in that tournament. They can act, they've
Yeah.
only won two in a row. They're going for a three-peat. It's happening down in Australia and New Zealand. I think that tournament will also get Americans excited about soccer and about
Yeah.
women's soccer. And so when we talk about soccer in this country, we have to realize it's like tennis. The men and the women are pretty much in the same sphere. And so I
Yeah.
don't want to leave the podcast without mentioning the fact that the Women's World Cup is coming and that maybe that will help keep soccer in the conversation and
Yep.
will help the market and will help interest and all that stuff at the same time. So
Yeah, and thank you for not that I forgot. Well, I guess in a sense I forgot, but sort of out of sight, out of mind. And thank you for getting that in there too. And that'll sort of bridge a year, let's say, out of the four, where it'll be in the forefront as well, especially if the U.S. women happen to win it again, and like you said, three-peat. That just has a nice ring to it. So we'll see if they can get it done.
well,
Clemente, as always, thank you for coming on,
thank you.
sharing your expertise, sharing that personal story with Pele. As I always do, I give the guests sort of the final word. Plug your book, website, whatever you want to plug. You take your time.
Thank you. Yeah, John, it's always great being on with you. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Clemente Lisi. My book is called The FIFA World Cup: A History of the Planet's Biggest Sporting Event. You can find that on Amazon. And I want to thank John because you had me on early on last summer when it was still in pre-sale. One of the first interviews I did was
Yeah.
with you. After that, I was interviewed by a bunch of places, including the Washington Post. But I'm not going to forget the fact that you had me
I'm
on
gonna take
first.
all that credit.
Yeah, you had me on first, so I appreciate that. And also, I want to mention the fact that I started up a new soccer website. It's called Planet Soccer. You can find that at planetsoccer.substack.com. And there's soccer news on there, and my thoughts on the game, and even some collectible stuff if I have time. So check it out. You can subscribe for free. And yeah, drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you if you're into soccer cards or just soccer in general.
Well, thanks, and I don't know a better advocate or ambassador of the sport. I know you love it. It comes out of your pores, and you know it, and you're passionate about it, and that's very important. I appreciate you sharing that with our listeners. So thanks, Clemente.
Thank you.